There was a rumor in the wizarding world. Ever since Professor Dumbledore had refused the Dark Lord's request to teach defense against the dark arts at Hogwarts, the position had been cursed. Though unconfirmed, almost all wizards accepted this explanation. The reason was simple. Since that incident, every professor who took the position would leave after a year for various reasons. Because of this, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had to recruit a new defense against the dark arts professor every year. 10 years ago, although Voldemort had vanished thanks to the boy who lived, Harry Potter, the curse he left behind seemed to remain unbroken. The defense against the dark arts professorship still maintained its annual accident rate. The reasons for the professor's departures were varied and colorful. Elderly parents or young children needing care, wives divorcing and taking half their assets, feeling inadequate for the position, sudden accidents causing poor health. So, when Professor Quirinus Quirrell volunteered to take on the position, Dumbledore and McGonagall agreed without hesitation. Quirinus Quirrell, a Ravenclaw graduate, had been famous for his exceptional talent during his student years. Though he had previously been teaching Muggle studies, his theoretical knowledge was extremely solid. After being confirmed as the defense against the dark arts professor, Quirrell was not content with mere theory. He wanted first-hand practical experience. Before the new term began, he took time to accumulate practical experience in defense against the dark arts. His approach was supported and understood by the other professors. For defense against the dark arts, practical experience was indeed important. What no one expected was that when Quirrell traveled to the Dark Forest, he ran into trouble. Though he later successfully escaped and returned to school, he seemed like a completely different person from then on. Everyone believed he had been scared witless by vampires and hags. Not only did his speech become stuttering, but he also began to fear everything, including his own students. His cowardice and helplessness were fully exposed. Yet it was precisely this timid and cowardly man who was now staring intently at Harry with complete focus. His gaze carried a decisiveness and cruelty completely inconsistent with his usual persona. The corners of his mouth even curved slightly upward, bearing some resemblance to Sherlock's mocking expression when mentioning Scotland Yard. Just Snape. If he could just hold on for a few more seconds, he would be able to knock this little boy off his broomstick. No matter how many countercurses Snape recited, it would be useless. This was his confidence as a Ravenclaw, and his reliance on that person as his backing. His usual disguise was too perfect, and with everyone's attention focused on the match, no one noticed Quirrell's abnormality. But precisely for this reason, Quirrell himself failed to notice Hermione nearby. It wasn't until half a minute later, when a scream rang out, that he began to realize what was happening. Cursing under his breath, he hurriedly began extinguishing the flames on his body. At the same time, his mind was filled with alarm and suspicion. Had he been exposed? Once Quirrell stopped his concentrated stare, Snape immediately gained the upper hand. With his help, Harry quickly regained control of his broom. Harry kept Sherlock's instructions firmly in mind. Once free from danger, he must quickly end the match and absolutely not give Quirrell a second chance. It could be said that Harry's luck was truly excellent. Almost the instant he regained control, he spotted his target and dove toward the ground. Before others could react, he had already landed. Under the shocked gazes of everyone in the stadium, Harry nimbly leaped down from his broomstick. He clenched his fist, raised it high above his head, and waved it vigorously. The entire sequence flowed like water, truly a sight to behold. As Madame Hooch's whistle sounded, the match ended. Harry instinctively looked toward the banner section. Though the distance was too great to see clearly, he believed Sherlock was surely watching him. Unfortunately, he was mistaken. Sherlock's gaze was shifting between Snape and Quirrell. Judging from this confrontation's outcome, Snape was no match for Quirrell. This meant his previous deduction had been confirmed. At this moment, Lee Jordan also announced the match result loudly, with Harry catching the golden snitch. Gryffindor won 170-40. Though the match had ended, the scene remained chaotic. The Gryffindor team believed it was Flint's collision that had caused Harry's broom problems. Slytherin naturally refused to admit it. Only dark magic could make a broomstick behave like that. Flint didn't have that kind of ability. Even if Flint had used some underhanded trick, they certainly couldn't admit it. Watching Gryffindor, whom they had always kept under their heel, suddenly turn the tables with such swagger, they were particularly displeased. Their words inevitably became cursing and shoving. The expressions of both teams gradually became fierce, their language progressively vile, their actions increasingly violent, until conflict finally erupted. As the players from both sides began wrestling, the spectators in the stands couldn't sit still either, jumping down to support their respective houses. "Let's go! Go, 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 go!" With Sherlock's call, Ron, Dean, and Seamus all had their faces lit up with excitement as they charged down with him. Hermione and Neville hesitated for a moment, then followed Sherlock into the field. Surprisingly, Sherlock didn't participate in the brawl. At his reminder, Hagrid found Harry immediately and then led the four of them away. With the half-giant's massive body, despite the extremely chaotic scene, their path remained unobstructed. "Sherlock, I thought when you called us down, we were going to beat up those guys. I was already prepared to give Malfoy's nose a good punch." After reaching Hagrid's hut, Ron took the strong tea Hagrid handed him and grumbled somewhat dissatisfiedly. "It's pointless," Sherlock said calmly. There were quite a few professors watching the match. The situation would be brought under control quickly. All right. Ron was just complaining instinctively. Hearing Sherlock's explanation, he brought up another matter. "Sherlock, I still think Snape isn't a good person. I saw it clearly. His eyes were fixed on Harry, his mouth kept chanting spells, never stopping. Impossible! Absolutely impossible!" Hagrid was typically thick-headed. Despite being right there in the stands, he was completely unaware of what had happened around him. Hearing Ron say this, he naturally objected strongly. Why would Professor Snape do such a thing? He has absolutely no reason to harm Harry. Ron scratched his head. Maybe because he was Harry's father's romantic rival? Merlin's beard. Hagrid stared at Harry in amazement. "Harry, which bastard told you this? I'm going to give that gossip-mongering fellow a good beating." "No one told me about this," Harry said proudly. "It was Sherlock who deduced it." The facts proved that Sherlock's deduction had once again been validated. "Oh, you greedy gargoyle!" Hagrid had long since witnessed Sherlock's abilities, but hearing this news still couldn't help but exclaim in wonder. He stared at Sherlock for a long while before saying slowly, "You can see through people's hearts just like Dumbledore, but even so, Professor Snape would never harm Harry." Sherlock glanced at Ron. "He said that, not me." "Ron." "Also, according to my deduction, Professor Snape was actually trying to protect Harry just now, but unfortunately he was no match for Professor Quirrell." "Who?" Hagrid suddenly felt his brain wasn't quite keeping up. "Who did you say?" "Quirinus Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor," Sherlock said calmly. When Sherlock said that the person trying to harm Harry was Quirrell, Hagrid was immediately shocked. "No. I mean, why do you always like to suspect Hogwarts professors? First it was Snape, now it's Quirrell. This is simply impossible." Before Hagrid could finish speaking, Sherlock directly interrupted him. "It is Professor Quirrell. The troll on Halloween was released by him." Hagrid, confused face. By the way, that night he originally intended to check the mechanisms protecting the Philosopher's Stone, but was stopped by Professor Snape. It was Professor Snape, whom Ron suspected, who nearly had his leg bitten off by your big dog, Hagrid. This time it wasn't just Hagrid whose eyes widened. All four people present stared simultaneously. "What stone did you say?" "Snape stopped Quirrell." "Merlin's beard. How do you know about Fluffy?" "Sherlock, how many more things are you hiding from us?" Facing four inquiring gazes, Sherlock sighed deeply. Looking at this situation, he understood that unless he explained things clearly, the conversation couldn't continue. "The Philosopher's Stone is a substance with special properties and the main ingredient for the elixir of life," Sherlock said, turning to Harry. "My friend, if you still remember the wizard cards from Chocolate Frogs, you should recall the introduction to Dumbledore." "Sorry, I don't remember," Harry said shamefully. Sherlock shrugged. Dumbledore's widely known contributions include defeating the Dark Wizard Grindelwald in 1945, discovering the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and achieving remarkable success in alchemy with his partner Nicholas Flamel. Under the stunned gazes of the four, Sherlock recited this passage directly. "Sherlock, how did you memorize all this?" Harry found it incomprehensible. Yes, he had indeed looked at the wizard cards initially, and the content about Dumbledore had left a deep impression on him. But asking him to completely recite the content after more than 2 months was simply impossible. "I've told you before that the human brain is like a hard drive. As long as you choose to discard useless things, you can naturally remember the information you need. You can all do the same." Faced with Sherlock's matter-of-fact statement, the four exchanged glances, momentarily at a loss for words. "That kind of thing, probably only you could do it, right? The success in alchemy with Nicholas Flamel refers to the Philosopher's Stone." Sherlock then turned to Hagrid and asked unexpectedly, "Fluffy is your hunting dog, right?" Still in shock, Hagrid answered unconsciously, "That's right, Fluffy is very loyal. I bought him last year from a guy I met at a pub. That guy seemed to be called Baskerville or something. Later I lent him to Dumbledore to guard the Philosopher's Stone." The words stopped abruptly here. "Did you deduce this too?" Hagrid could no longer sit still. He stood up suddenly, his eyes wide as saucers, his voice beginning to tremble slightly. This first-year little wizard was truly terrifying. Half deduction, half what Dumbledore told me. Sherlock was quite satisfied with Hagrid's honesty. He placed his hands together under his chin, looking at him intently. The Hound of the Baskervilles? That does sound quite interesting. Hearing that it was Dumbledore who had told Sherlock the information, Hagrid breathed a slight sigh of relief. Good, good. If all this news had been deduced entirely by Sherlock, that would have been somewhat too incredible. But then again, a first-year student being able to do what he'd done so far was already quite impressive. Also, why did Dumbledore tell Sherlock everything? After briefly explaining to Hagrid and the three friends, Sherlock made a summary statement. From today's actions by Snape and Quirrell, we can confirm three things. First, Quirrell is indeed Voldemort's minion. Hearing this name, both Hagrid and Ron gasped and shuddered. Harry and Hermione were naturally unmoved, and Sherlock remained expressionless. Second, Quirrell, or rather Voldemort, wants to obtain the Philosopher's Stone. By the way, Hagrid, the one who broke into Gringotts was him. Ah. Hagrid widened his eyes again. Before he could react, Sherlock explained, Harry told me that you met at the Leaky Cauldron. Before Hagrid could figure out the connection, he heard Sherlock continue, Third, Professor Snape is not Professor Quirrell's match. Why do you say that? This time it was Hermione who asked the question. Professor Snape is a potions master, while Quirrell looks timid and cowering. Don't be deceived by appearances, Hermione. Quirrell's strength is much greater than his appearance suggests. Even with Snape already beginning the countercurse, Quirrell could still control the broomstick through nonverbal spells. Only when you interfered with his spellcasting did Professor Snape gain the upper hand. Of course, destruction is always easier than protection. After Sherlock finished speaking, everyone in the hut fell silent. School had been in session for more than 2 months, and even Harry and Hermione, who had grown up in the Muggle world, now had a clear understanding of Voldemort's power. Now hearing that even Hogwarts professors had become his minions was naturally difficult to accept at first. Sherlock, you said Professor Dumbledore already knows about this, right? Hermione suddenly asked. Yes. Seeing Sherlock give an affirmative answer, she immediately smiled. Then there's nothing to worry about. Even during the Wizarding War, Hogwarts was the only safe place. Everyone says Professor Dumbledore is the only person Voldemort fears. Hearing Hermione's words, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Right, as long as Hogwarts had Headmaster Dumbledore, Quirrell wouldn't dare act rashly. As for today's events, hadn't Sherlock discussed them with Dumbledore in advance? Since Quirrell had now surfaced, there was nothing to worry about. Having figured this out, Hagrid's hut was immediately filled with cheerful atmosphere. With the end of the Quidditch match, Harry's fame soared. Originally the savior of the Wizarding world, he now had a new title, Quidditch Genius. Of course, whether it was the Halloween troll in the dungeons or the broomstick at the Quidditch pitch, matters related to Quirrell still hadn't spread. This resulted in Sherlock's reputation also rising considerably, apart from Harry's. The version circulating among teachers and students was that Sherlock had deduced Hermione's location in the girls' bathroom through Professor Quirrell's actions on Halloween. Not only that, he had acted immediately and rescued Hermione from the troll's hands. Such brave behavior naturally earned the admiration of the little Gryffindor lions. Additionally, his reasoning ability also caught the attention of the little Ravenclaw eagles. After the wizard duel incident, some students had already begun consulting Sherlock. However, most were from his own house, and the questions were relatively simple. But after this incident, students from other houses gradually began appearing among those seeking Sherlock's help. After Monday morning's History of Magic class ended, Sherlock saw off several senior Ravenclaw students who had come to find him. When he returned to the classroom, he was greeted by his friends' surprised gazes. They're all my clients. Without waiting for their questions, Sherlock proactively explained. Clients. Everyone exchanged glances. Calling fellow students clients seemed rather odd, didn't it? Ever since the Halloween incident spread, people have been coming to me for help. Speaking of which, I have to thank Mr. Neville Longbottom for this. My first few clients all found me through his introductions. Neville. Several of them turned to look at Neville, who was stroking the toad he had just found. Hearing Sherlock's praise, he lowered his head bashfully. After I successfully helped them, more and more people gradually came to ask for my assistance. Actually, these troublesome matters for them simply require someone else's guidance. I listen carefully to their account of the facts, they listen to my advice, and once the problem is solved, the fee goes into my pocket. With Sherlock's explanation, his friends understood why he called these students clients. Though they found it somewhat incredible, Considering Sherlock's abilities, they suddenly felt it wasn't incomprehensible. "If only I could be as clever as Holmes," Seamus said with considerable envy. "Even Ravenclaw students come to you, that's truly remarkable." Everyone knew that Ravenclaw represented wisdom. When the little eagles of Ravenclaw came to consult Sherlock, it naturally meant his intelligence had gained recognition from that usually proud and haughty group. Even Hermione Granger, who was already called the know-it-all, didn't receive such treatment. Since today's History of Magic class had ended relatively early and everyone wasn't in a hurry to eat, they decided to chat a bit more. "Speaking of which, I just learned that Mercury died yesterday," Dean said with a regretful expression. "Who?" Everyone looked at each other in confusion. "Freddie Mercury. Haven't any of you heard of him?" Seamus couldn't help but add another explanation when he saw his friend's topic hadn't resonated. "Freddie Mercury? Is he some famous wizard?" Neville asked weakly. "I haven't heard of the Mercury family," Hermione pondered for a moment, then looked at Ron. "What about you?" Ron shrugged. "Same here. Freddie Mercury, British male singer, lead vocalist of Queen." Sherlock, who was silent until now, shocked everyone present when he finally spoke. Seamus looked at him incredulously. "Holmes, you actually know about Mercury?" In his view, apart from Weasley and Longbottom, who came from wizarding families, both Potter and Granger should have known more about Mercury than Holmes. But the reality was that only Holmes knew about him. Needless to say, Sherlock's three close friends were even more surprised. They knew Sherlock's character all too well. This was someone who only knew the Earth revolved around the sun when talking about universe. How could such a person know about a band and its lead singer? "Queen. Is it very famous?" Neville raised his hand and asked weakly once again. "More than famous." When it came to music, Dean immediately transformed from his classroom drowsiness and began speaking eloquently. After Queen was formed in London in 1971, they immediately released their first self-titled album, Queen. The 1975 release, A Night at the Opera, brought the band commercial breakthrough, with Bohemian Rhapsody winning Best British Single at the first Brit Awards. The 1977 release, News of the World, had enormous influence, particularly the singles We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions, which have been widely used in sporting events since the 1980s. The 1981 Greatest Hits collection sold over 6 million copies, becoming the best-selling album in the UK. Just last year, they received the Outstanding Contribution to Music Award at the Brit Awards. Watching Dean excitedly educating everyone, his friends all showed surprised expressions. Was this still the same little guy they knew? He seemed like a completely different person. Only Seamus was unsurprised by Dean's performance, continuing his friend's narrative. Queen fused glam rock, progressive rock, classical music, and heavy metal into one, influencing almost all heavy metal bands of the late 20th century. He suddenly paused, then said with sudden realization, "I understand why Holmes knows about Mercury. Dean mentioned you play violin very well." With this observation, Harry, Ron, and Neville, who shared a dormitory with Sherlock, immediately understood. Yes, since Sherlock played violin so well, knowing such a famous band wasn't strange at all. "What? You also play violin?" Only Hermione looked surprised. This was the first time she'd learned about this. "I heard he died from pneumonia caused by AIDS, only 45 years old." "What a pity." Yes, his 4-octave range and brilliant, soaring voice were simply wonderful. Ron and Neville looked at each other. Muggle World bands were definitely their knowledge-blind spot. Harry and Hermione weren't much better off, though when Seamus and Dean sang We Will Rock You, both realized they had heard this song before. For Sherlock, although Queen didn't have a dedicated violin member, as Seamus said, many of their works incorporated classical music elements. This was why he, skilled at violin, also knew about Queen. The group then suggested returning to the dormitory to ask Sherlock to play a piece. Just then, there was a knocking sound at the door. Looking up, they saw a young witch walk in. She had 2 golden braids and a slightly flushed face. "Abbott, what brings you here?" When Hermione saw her, she immediately asked in surprise. This little girl was Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff. Because she was the first to wear the sorting hat during the ceremony, Hermione had a vivid impression of her. "Granger, you're here too. Wonderful." Abbott seemed quite happy to see Hermione, then immediately said, "I've come to find Mr. Holmes." As she spoke, her gaze unconsciously drifted toward Sherlock. Seeing this situation, everyone understood and smiled as they stood up to leave. Hermione walked last, but just as she was about to exit, Abbott suddenly reached out to stop her, saying pleadingly, "Granger, please don't leave. I beg you." Hermione was somewhat surprised and looked toward Sherlock. "Hermione, if you could stay for a while, you might be of great help to me." Hermione had been quite interested in Abbott coming to find Sherlock, but with everyone else gone, staying alone felt somewhat awkward. But now that both Sherlock and Abbott had said this, she sat down accordingly. "Now then, Miss Abbott, you can tell me what's troubling you." "How do you know I'm troubled?" Hannah Abbott asked in surprise. 4 knocks when knocking, ordinary people only knock twice, 3 at most. When Hannah Abbott asked why he knew she was troubled, Sherlock replied thus. "Holmes, you truly live up to your reputation." Hannah Abbott exclaimed in amazement. Indeed, she did have troubles. "Well then, let's begin as quickly as possible." Sherlock placed his hands together under his chin, gazing intently at the young witch. Hannah Abbott nodded, took a deep breath, and began recounting the events. "My father works at the Ministry of Magic in document management. Recently, while organizing a batch of classified documents, he may have made an error due to momentary carelessness, causing a document to be misplaced. As a result, someone at the ministry made a big fuss about it, accusing him of deliberately leaking secrets. Now he faces serious disciplinary action and might even be sent to Azkaban." At this point, Hannah Abbott's eyes reddened and her voice trembled. Sherlock didn't notice this, or perhaps noticed but didn't care. He opened his notebook and continued questioning. "When your father mentioned this document, did he say anything special about it? Remember, any detail, however seemingly insignificant, could be crucial." "Father said the document was protected by a special encryption charm that could only be opened with a specific magical key." "Where was the document kept?" "Locked in a safe with multiple protective magic wards." "Are you certain?" "Certain. Father said the same thing when questioned by the ministry, but it just suddenly appeared somewhere else." Hearing this, Sherlock frowned slightly, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. After a moment, he asked further. "Before the document was discovered, did anything unusual happen at the ministry?" "Unusual?" Hannah Abbott didn't quite understand Sherlock's meaning. "For instance, did anyone frequently enter or leave your father's office, or were any strange magical fluctuations detected?" Hannah Abbott closed her eyes, frowning as she tried hard to remember. Sherlock didn't interrupt, just quietly watched her. Hermione looked between Hannah Abbott and Sherlock. The former was deep in thought, contrasting sharply with the latter's confident demeanor. "Oh yes." Hannah Abbott's eyes suddenly lit up. "Father mentioned that a few days before the document went missing, the protective magical array in his office had a brief, inexplicable fluctuation. But he conducted a thorough inspection at the time, found nothing unusual, and didn't pay much attention to it." Sherlock nodded and turned to Hermione. "My friend, if someone wanted to use magic to bypass the safe's protection and steal documents, would it cause magical fluctuations?" "Absolutely," Hermione answered without hesitation, then realized. "You mean—" "Wait, I have a few more questions." Interrupted by Sherlock, Hermione wasn't annoyed. She'd long grown accustomed to his manner. This guy was just like that. Sherlock then began detailed inquiries about the ministry office layout, document storage locations, and various details of her father's daily work routine. Abbott had often visited the ministry to see her father since childhood, so she could basically answer Sherlock's questions, though she wasn't clear on all the details. But that was fine. Mother managed to let me bring the ministry's investigation report on this matter, plus this letter describing father's account of events. Abbott produced a stack of materials as she spoke. Sherlock's eyes brightened. He had been frowning before. Abbott's description could only serve as reference. This report and her father's testimony were more useful. He examined them carefully while beginning to sketch in his notebook. Unfortunately, conditions didn't allow for an on-site investigation at the ministry. It seemed he'd have to emulate Poirot this time. Fortunately, the ministry's report was quite detailed. Though some parts remained unclear, it was sufficient for deducing the truth of this matter. "I believe the truth has surfaced." Under Hermione and Abbott's amazed gazes, Sherlock looked up and spoke. "This was far too quick. This person is very likely your father's competitor at the ministry, someone who has long coveted your father's position and seized this opportunity to orchestrate this conspiracy." "Mr. Holmes, who are you referring to?" Abbott looked confused. Sherlock's sudden statement left her somewhat unable to process it. "Wright Blake, Mr. Blake." "Him?" Hannah immediately showed surprise. "He hasn't had any feud with my father." Sherlock shook his head and explained. "Based on your father's description and the materials provided in this report, this document's encryption method is an extremely rare and complex ancient magical encryption technique. Anyone capable of breaking it must have deep research into ancient magic. Few people meet this criterion, and Mr. Wright Blake happens to be one of them. Additionally, the safe's protective magic requires simultaneously breaking at least 3 different types of magical locks to open. This requires not only superior magical ability but also close knowledge of the Ministry's internal security system structure. Wright Blake happens to be responsible for the security system in your father's area, which makes him highly suspicious. Furthermore, Sherlock picked up his notebook, pointing to the sketch he'd drawn and continuing, "From this investigation report, in the week before the document went missing, Mr. Blake entered and exited your father's office more frequently than usual, staying for considerable periods each time. Of course, he claimed this was just to discuss work. But your father said those so-called discussion topics were mostly trivial, unimportant matters. This strongly suggests he was likely using these opportunities to find the optimal timing for implementing his plan. Your father simply didn't notice. Also, he has always been jealous of your father's talent. Though this is my deduction, I believe it shouldn't be wrong. Because in the recent promotion evaluation, he lost to your father, which undoubtedly became his strong motive for the crime." After hearing Sherlock's analysis, Abbott was both shocked and delighted. Hermione gently patted her hand, looking at Sherlock with shining eyes. "Holmes, you're amazing. So, what should we do now?" "Don't worry, Miss Abbott. We still need to collect evidence to prove your father's innocence and that person's guilt. Although the Ministry has restricted your father's movements, fortunately your mother can still move freely. So next, we need her and your father's friends at the Ministry to watch that person's movements, particularly looking for attempts to destroy magical traces related to the document, or any contact with suspicious individuals. Also, I suggest you tell Professor Sprout about this. I believe she'll provide considerable help. Meanwhile, I'll use some methods here to further search for evidence." At this point, he turned to look at Hermione. "Hermione, please help by researching materials about ancient magical decryption and Ministry security system vulnerabilities. We might find key clues to his method." Hermione couldn't help but pause. Ancient magical decryption was one thing, but Ministry security system vulnerabilities? Could such things actually be researched? Hannah Abbott didn't think so much, but began tearfully expressing her gratitude to Sherlock. Sherlock gave her a reassuring smile. "Miss Abbott, truth will never be buried. As long as we search with dedication, we will surely discover it." After seeing off Hannah Abbott, Hermione sat across from Sherlock, staring directly at him. "What is it, my friend?" "Detective Sherlock, please tell me where I should look for Ministry security system vulnerabilities." Well. Sherlock shook his head lightly. "I've already discovered some from the Ministry's case report." "What?" Hermione looked at Sherlock incredulously. "Unfortunately, even knowing these vulnerabilities, I have no way to exploit them. After all, this is the magical world. If I were 20 now, actually, 17 should be sufficient." "Hermione, asterisk. What, listening to your tone, do you want to pull off some big heist at the Ministry?" But what I truly didn't expect was that the magical world also has its own Scotland Yard. If it were Harry and Ron, they might not understand this statement's meaning. But Hermione did. "It seems you're quite dissatisfied with Scotland Yard." Actually, they do have certain action capabilities and basic investigative skills. When handling routine cases, they can methodically conduct clue collection, witness interviews, and such work. Unfortunately, many detectives there have rather rigid thinking, often following established case-solving patterns, lacking innovative thinking and bold reasoning hypotheses. Particularly when facing complex criminal cases, Scotland Yard's response speed and strategies often fall short. For example, the burglary case before school started, they overlooked key clues, causing the case investigation to reach an impasse. Hearing Sherlock mercilessly point out Scotland Yard's flaws, Hermione didn't know what to say for a moment. She had sometimes heard her parents and other family elders complain about Scotland Yard's low efficiency, but no one had ever been able to clearly identify the problems like Sherlock. What I didn't expect was that the Ministry is no better. Actually, this case is very simple, just like the previous problems I've helped others solve. Because I have this ability to analyze things using intuition, they provide me with all the evidence, and I try to guide them onto the right track. In fact, all criminal behavior has very similar aspects. If you can know the detailed particulars of 1,000 cases inside and out, yet cannot explain the 1,001st case, that would be strange. If I encounter complex cases, I'm afraid I'd still need to travel around and personally investigate. This case's main difficulty lies in having too many clues. Extremely important clues were obscured by completely irrelevant traces. Actually, the information provided in the Ministry's report alone was sufficient for deduction, as long as one could select the necessary parts and string them together in order. But the Ministry turned a blind eye to those clues hidden beneath the surface. In fact, the Ministry gave me the impression of just wanting to close cases quickly. At this point, Sherlock frowned deeply. As for who the real culprit is, they don't care. So even though I've provided the correct approach, I'm afraid Mrs. Abbott will still need considerable effort to resolve this matter. However, since she was able to bring out the ministry's investigation report, plus Professor Sprout's help, I believe this matter will ultimately reach a fair conclusion." Here, Sherlock paused. "Oh, and thank you for reminding me of that young lady's name earlier." "Ah, good grief, so if I hadn't called out Hannah Abbott's name at the beginning, you wouldn't even have known?" But thinking about it, that made sense. This guy had said before that his brain was like a hard drive, never storing information he considered useless. Not remembering classmates' names wasn't a first or second occurrence. Hermione even somewhat suspected that if Ron didn't share a dormitory with Sherlock, the latter might not even remember the former's name. Time flows like fine sand through fingers, always slipping away unnoticed. In the process of learning magical knowledge, morning training with Harry, teaching Hermione to fly, and helping classmates solve problems, Sherlock had been at Hogwarts for nearly 4 months. This also meant Christmas was coming. Like Halloween, this originally religious holiday had evolved over time into a public holiday throughout the world. On this day, everyone would exchange gifts and hold feasts. To add atmosphere, Christmas trees, stockings, hats, wreaths, and other holiday-specific decorations would make their sparkling debut. It could be said to be quite lively. For Hogwarts young witches and wizards, this holiday was more important than Halloween. On one hand, its arrival meant the end of the first term. The entire school would welcome a full 2 weeks of vacation, not returning until New Year's Day of the following year. On the other hand, children were all hopefully waiting for a red-hatted, white-bearded old man to appear and deliver gifts to their hands. Of course, in the magical world, owls actually fulfilled this responsibility. But this didn't affect the children's beautiful wishes. The school had also prepared early, having all students register whether they wanted to stay at school for the holidays. The vast majority of students chose to go home. This was normal. After all, in these full 7 years of school life, there were only 2 opportunities each year to return home. Of course, there were exceptions. "I really feel sorry for those people," Malfoy said sarcastically during a potions class. "They have to spend Christmas at other people's houses because their own families don't want them." Despite repeatedly hitting walls, Malfoy still took every opportunity to antagonize Harry. Of course, because of Sherlock, he didn't dare be too aggressive, only causing trouble subtly. By now, he had discovered a fact: if he only took some not too excessive verbal advantages, Sherlock wouldn't bother with him. This discovery excited him immensely, so naturally he wouldn't pass up such opportunities. However, this time, not only did Sherlock ignore him, even Harry couldn't be bothered to respond. Because Harry originally didn't want to return to Privet Drive to spend Christmas with the Dursleys. So even though Malfoy deliberately looked at Harry while speaking, with Crabbe and Goyle snickering nearby, Harry wasn't upset at all. He even found it somewhat amusing. This made Malfoy even more gloomy, feeling as if he'd punched cotton. On the contrary, for Harry, this might very well be the best Christmas he'd ever spend in his life. Actually, when Professor McGonagall initially came to register students staying for the holidays, he had originally intended to sign up. "Sherlock, I won't go home for Christmas." "No, you're going home." "Home?" Harry said in surprise. "Sherlock, you know my family situation." "My home," Sherlock said calmly. "My parents want to meet my friend."